Trying to put a ribbon on a sham process doesn't make it any less of a sham.
Democrats are trying to impeach the president because they are scared they cannot defeat him at the ballot box.
This is unprecedented. It's not only unprecedented, this is Soviet-style rules.
Welcome back to Morning Joe. We've got Donnie Deutsch joining our conversation. Also with us, member of the House Homeland Security and Veterans Affairs Committees, Democratic Congressman Max Rose of New York. He's a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, a recipient of the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. Congressman, great to have you with us.
Good to see you, too. Happy belated Halloween.
Happy Halloween to you. So let's talk about the vote yesterday. You voted for the resolution to move forward and make this public now. Why did you vote that way?
Well, first of all, yesterday was definitely, I've now been a member of Congress for close to a year. Yesterday was the saddest day of my time in Congress. This is a somber moment. No one comes to Congress wanting to impeach the President of the United States. But at this point, I do believe that these allegations are incredibly credible, and they're very serious. And this actually, for me, revolves around an anti-corruption issue. Did the President of the United States use the apparatus of the state, along with his cronies or associates or whatever you'd like to call them, to advance his own self-interest, not the interests of the state, not the interests of the American people? So right now we are asking questions on behalf of the American people and in defense of the Constitution, and that's what we came to Congress to do.
And so let me ask you about the criticism you heard from Jim Jordan, Steve Scalise, and others, that this was somehow a secret operation, that a Soviet style was the term they used, in a secret chamber, also known as the SCIF, down in the basement of the Capitol. How do you respond to that they didn't get their fair hearing?
So I'm still at the point where I can remember what it's like not to be a member of Congress. And you turn on the news. I even remember seeing the news when I was deployed to Afghanistan, and you become so frustrated with politics. So frustrated because it seems that elected officials now have more allegiance to their own party and to their next re-election than they do to actually advancing the interests of the American people. Here we are at a very serious moment, a somber moment, but a moment that could help build the future for the United States of America. And to see these elected officials, who I believe their heart deep down inside is in the right place, but to see them putting politics first.
Is their heart in the right place? I got to push.
Look,
Congressman, I'm not seeing their heart in the right place.
I am still an optimistic, hopeful person.
That's because it's less than a year you've been in Congress.
Right. But look, what is happening right now, to answer your question, what is happening right now is we're moving to the next stage of this process, moving to the public stage. And I am praying for Steve Scalise and Kevin McCarthy that they're going to start to put the country first. So I wouldn't have gotten into this business. I wouldn't have run in the district that I ran in if I was not hopeful that people can do the right thing.
I do believe those characters that we saw in there, their hearts are not in the right place and they will not get there. Having said that, though, I do think, to pick up on the last segment, I do think there's a handful. We're still looking at today and what it looks like. Let's fast forward, and we've watched Vinland in his uniform talk about and use the words, he put our national security at risk. To me, let's also think about John Bolton staying. We haven't seen that theater yet. And I think that particularly if the Democrats and Nancy Pelosi strategically cannot make this complicated, I don't even want to make it about the Ukraine, and it comes down to they have played with your national security. Bring it back to the kitchen table. It's not abstract. It's not military aid. It's not Ukraine. It's not about the Bidens. It is about that this president, his primal main purpose is to protect us. And he basically now made you at home less safe. Our national security, your national security is at risk. That's something that can start to resonate.
It's bigger than that. I got to push back on that. The question here is centered around him advancing his own self-interest. Because when
that's the A, but the B that matters to a voter is how does it affect me? That's the A. I'm saying it's been the A to the B.
And I'll tell you why this affects the voter. Because it's not just the president who's potentially advancing his self-interest. It's the pharmaceutical companies in Washington, D.C., who are jacking up the price of pharmaceutical drugs each and every year. It's the whole edifice of corporate PACs and federal lobbyists.
I agree with it, but for this impeachment message, you gotta keep it simple.
And there's nothing more simple than an anti-corruption message.
So, Congressman, have you, based on what you've seen and what we've seen publicly already, do you believe the president has committed impeachable offenses?
Well, that would be, I don't think that would be the responsible way to approach this. I meant it when I said that we are asking questions on behalf of the American people right now. The allegations are incredibly credible. Okay, they are backed up by multiple people. And what's interesting, though, is what you see the Republican Party doing in response to this. First, they say, look, this is a secret process. We're not asking questions. There are people who were right in there asking questions. Then they storm the skiff as their own colleagues are there asking questions. Then they say this has to be public. And as we move to this next phase, they still vote against it. So I look forward to seeing next week how they're going to move the goalpost, because they do not want to look at the facts. They do not want to ask questions, and they don't want to put the country first. That's incredibly disappointing.
And Republicans have said, well, we can't see the transcripts of the interview yesterday. Adam Schiff said, I'm putting those out next week, too. Gene Robinson has a question for you, Congressman.
Yeah, Congressman, what do you hear from your constituents? Are they willing to look at the facts? Do they push back when you talk to them? What are you hearing?
Yeah, so look, my constituents, just like all American people, are very smart. I think they're wise, and I think that they are committed to putting the country first here. What they want in an elected official is someone who's going to show integrity, someone who's going to actually not think about the immediate poll, but think about doing the right thing. My election is more than a year away. So some people are pissed off, and some people are elated, and some people aren't even aware of what's going on. But right now, what's important is us doing our job and continuing to earn the trust of the American people. We're not just in a fact-finding mission right now. We are in a trust-building exercise. And that is the way that government should actually work.
Congressman, do you think this can be done by Thanksgiving? There's some concern about whether this is going to bleed into the primaries, the Senate trial in January, February.
Right.
Do you think the timing here is, do you think Nancy Pelosi's got control of the timetable?
If anyone is worried about timing right now, if anyone is worried about the politics of the situation or the presidential election, they shouldn't be holding office. The only thing that we should be concerned with right now is getting to the bottom of this and earning the trust of the American people in the process. When you think about it, yesterday, what I did was the second most serious thing that I could do as a member of Congress, second only to declaring war, and that is initiating an impeachment inquiry of the President of the United States. We cannot subject this to politics. Unfortunately, my colleagues across the aisle, that's exactly what they're doing, and two wrongs don't make a right here.
Congressman, I want to follow up on what you said about how the president was basically using taxpayer dollars for personal gain. I think we can look at this even further and say, what's to stop the president from using other government entities because he thinks he could do nothing wrong to hurt people, creating an enemies list, getting the IRS to target certain people? I mean, I think that's where this argument needs to go of how fundamentally wrong the president's actions were. What we value in this country is our freedom. And the president, in many ways, is hurting that very concept.
Right. And what's ironic here is the president ran on the very notion of draining the swamp. He ran on trying to upend a system where it felt like elected officials as well as institutions were advancing their own self-interest against the interests and will of the American people. And here we are with very serious allegations that he may have done the same. But one thing we also have to consider, because there will come a day when President Trump is no longer in office, we have to think, how do we right this balance here, where the executive appears to be able to get away with anything? We have to figure out a way to realign the balance of powers. Now, I know that sounds wonky, but it is serious as we look to continue to defend and uphold the Constitution.
It's how he used the Department of Justice in a lot of ways. That's really what broke that measure, I think, for the public opinion.
Sure.
Congressman, we've been talking about how this is all playing with the president's base, people who support him, maybe some senators, if they would flip, if there were a trial here on impeachment. Your district, famously, President Trump won by 30 points. 2 years later, you come back as a Democrat and win that district. How is all this impeachment conversation playing on Staten
Island? Yeah, so he not 30 points. I mean, he won it by more than he won Texas, though, so definitely in the double digits. Right now, what you see, as I said, is people truly do, I believe, understand that these allegations are serious. But what I hear often is two things. First thing I hear is, well, look, Max, I get it. The president might have done something wrong, but everybody does it. Why are you singling this guy out for something when everybody does this? You know, presidents used to do this in the past. Senators are doing this all the time. It's for that reason that we should be coupling this with the most expansive anti-corruption effort in the history of the United States. The second thing we hear, though, is, oh, look, Max, this is a witch hunt. You guys were trying to get him from day one. Well, there are members of some of my colleagues in the Democratic Party who certainly wanted to impeach this guy before they were sworn in. They are totally wrong. There are also, though, members of the Republican Party, far too many, who wouldn't even consider initiating an inquiry of this president, no matter what he did, because there's an R next to his name. That is even worse. So my belief is that's why I talk so much about earning trust here, that we have got to look at this as a larger anti-corruption issue, as well as constantly show the American people that we are rising above the fray and not concerned with our own politics.
Congressman Max Rose of New York. Thanks, Congressman.
Thanks, guys.
Joe?
Thank you so much, Congressman. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.